The letter hit the floor of the Dusty Creek General Store like a stone dropped into still water, and every head in the room turned toward Birdie Prescott. She had not dropped it by accident. She had thrown it, deliberately, squarely at the boots of Clarence Fletcher, who stood 6 feet tall with his hat in his hand and his jaw tight, and his dark eyes holding that particular expression she had come to recognize over the past 6 weeks. The expression of a man who had decided something without telling her, and who expected her to simply accept it, and who had not yet understood that Birdie Prescott did not accept anything she had not first examined from every angle and decided on her own terms. "You lied to me," she said. Her voice was low enough that the women near the bolt cloth display had to strain to hear it, but it carried the kind of weight that made the storekeeper, Walt Greer, take 2 slow steps backward toward the door that led to his storeroom. "You wrote in that advertisement that you were looking for a woman of independent spirit who would be a partner, not a housekeeper, not an ornament, a partner." Clarence did not look at the letter on the floor. He kept his eyes on her face. "I meant that," he said. "Then explain to me why, when I told you I intended to keep my surveying work, you went to Judge Hartley and asked him whether a wife's earnings could be assigned to her husband's property deed without her signature." The silence in the store was absolute. Even the flies seemed to stop moving. "Birdie, because that is not a partner, Clarence Fletcher. That is a trap. That is a very well-constructed, very polite trap with an advertisement for bait." She stepped toward him, and she was not a tall woman, but she had a way of moving when she was angry that made her seem to fill whatever room she occupied. "And I would like to know whether every word you wrote in that letter was calculated to bring me here for that purpose, or whether you are simply a man who cannot help himself when he sees something he wants and decides to own it." The betrayal on her face was not loud. It was the worst kind, the quiet, settled kind, the kind that had already done its grieving and arrived at a conclusion. And Clarence Fletcher, who had faced down cattle thieves, and a drought that had nearly destroyed his ranch, and a creditor in Abilene who had once put a gun to his ribs, felt something crack open in his chest that no flood or drought or gun had ever managed. This was going to be the worst mistake of his life, and it had started, as all the worst mistakes did, with the very best of intentions. 6 weeks earlier, the advertisement had been Hank Mulligan's idea. Hank was Clarence's foreman and the closest thing he had to a friend who was not also a paid employee, which meant that Hank felt entitled to say things to Clarence that other men in Dusty Creek, Colorado, would not have dared. They had been sitting on the porch of the Fletcher Ranch house, which sat on 2,000 acres of good grazing land north of town, in the late September evening of 1882, when Hank said, without any particular preamble, "You are going to die alone out here and the bank is going to get this land, and neither of those things has to happen." Clarence had looked at him. "I'm serious," Hank said. "You need a wife. The Calloway brothers need to know this land is going to stay in one family. They have been circling this property for 2 years waiting for you to fail to produce an heir, and you know it as well as I do." Clarence knew it. The Calloway brothers, Dale and Royce Calloway, who ran the largest operation in the county and who had made no secret of their desire to absorb the Fletcher land into their own holdings, had been patient in the way that large predators are patient. They did not need to hurry. They simply needed to wait. "There is no woman in 3 counties I haven't already disappointed," Clarence said. It was not self-pity. It was a fact he stated the way a man states the distance to the nearest water source. "Mrs. Alderman's daughter won't look at me since I missed the harvest dance. The Jennings girl went to Denver. The widow Forsythe made it clear she prefers her independence, and I respect that. Even Reverend Albright's niece took one look at this house and said she required a porch swing." "Then you advertise," Hank said. Clarence turned his head very slowly and looked at his foreman. "I know it sounds desperate," Hank said, not backing down, "but it is a practical solution to a practical problem, and there is no shame in it. Men do it every day. You write an honest letter describing what you have and what you need, and you put it in the territorial papers and you wait." Clarence thought about it for 3 days. He thought about it during the morning rides and during the long silences over supper, and he thought about it lying awake in the two-large bedroom of the house his father had built, when this land was nothing but grass and possibility. The house had 4 bedrooms because his father had planned for children, and Clarence was 32 years old and slept alone in the largest one, and the other 3 were full of nothing but the kind of quiet that has a texture to it, that presses against your skin in the dark. On the 4th day, he sat down at his desk with a sheet of paper and wrote the advertisement. He wrote 3 drafts. The first was too formal. The second was too desperate. The third was, he felt, honest, and honesty was the thing he prized above all else because he had seen what its absence did to people and land and arrangements that had seemed solid. The advertisement, which ran in the Rocky Mountain News and the Colorado Transcript in October of 1882, read as follows: Rancher, 32, Dusty Creek, Colorado, seeks a woman of independent spirit and practical disposition for marriage and partnership. The ranch is profitable but demanding. The work is real and the winters are hard. What is offered is honest companionship, fair dealing, a comfortable house, and a man who will not diminish a woman's mind or her ambitions. Children hoped for but not demanded. Respond with frankness to C. Fletcher, Dusty Creek, Elbert County, Colorado. He received 11 responses. 9 of them were politely declined, 2 because the women changed their minds, 3 because they were already spoken for by the time his reply reached them, 1 because the woman's mother intervened, and 3 because when he wrote back honestly about the actual conditions of the ranch and the distance from town and the nature of the work, they decided they wanted something closer to civilization. The 10th response came from a widow in Santa Fe who was 70 years old and who wrote that she admired his frankness, but felt she was perhaps not what he had in mind, though she wished him well and enclosed a recipe for cornbread that she said was useful. The 11th response was from Birdie Prescott. Her letter arrived on a Wednesday morning in late October, and Clarence sat at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold beside him and read it 3 times. She wrote the way people speak when they have decided to waste no time on pleasantries and have no interest in performing a version of themselves that is more palatable than the real one. She wrote, Mr. Fletcher, I am responding to your advertisement because it is the first one I have read in 4 years of occasionally considering this question that did not make me feel I was being invited to audition for the role of domestic furnishing. I am 27 years old. I am a surveyor, trained by my father, William Prescott, who operated a survey practice in Laramie, Wyoming, until his death 14 months ago. I have continued the practice on my own, which has proved more difficult than I anticipated, not because the work is beyond me. It is not, but because the frontier territory is full of men who will hire a female surveyor only when no male one is available, and I am tired of waiting for that particular window of acceptability to open. I have no family remaining. I have a good horse, a theodolite, survey equipment, and enough savings to manage the journey to Colorado should you find my circumstances interesting rather than disqualifying. I am told I am not easy to live with. I am told I am too direct. I am telling you this because you said you wanted frankness and I am taking you at your word. I am also, I should say, aware that I am not the kind of woman these advertisements generally attract a response from, and I am at peace with the possibility that you will not write back. But I thought it worth trying. Sincerely, B. Prescott. Clarence read it a 4th time. Then he wrote back the same afternoon. He wrote, Miss Prescott, I am writing back immediately because your letter is the only one of the 11 I received that made me feel I was reading something true. I am not put off by your work. I have no quarrel with a woman who can survey land. In fact, I have several parcels on this ranch that I have never had properly mapped, and I have been meaning to address that for 3 years. I am not put off by your directness. I am put off by the lack of it, which is the more common problem in my experience. The winters here are serious. The nearest town is 4 miles. The work will be real, as I said, and I mean that. But the house is warm and the land is good, and I am prepared to be honest with you about everything if you are prepared to do the same. I would like to correspond further if you are willing. Respectfully, C. Fletcher. They wrote back and forth for 3 weeks. The letters were long and detailed and remarkably honest on both sides, and Clarence found himself doing something he had not done in years, looking forward to something. He found himself checking the mail with a feeling he could not immediately name, and then recognized as anticipation, which had been absent from his daily life for long enough that its return was startling. She wrote about her father and the years spent learning to read a landscape, to translate the physical world into numbers and lines on a page, to see land the way most people never could, as a system, as a relationship between elevation and water and the movement of weather. She wrote about what it felt like to be the only woman in a surveying party and how she had dealt with it, which was by being better at the work than everyone else and refusing to apologize for it. She wrote about Laramie and the difficulty of being a woman alone in a territory that had strong opinions about the proper arrangement of female lives. She wrote with a dark humor that appeared suddenly in the middle of otherwise practical paragraphs, and disappeared just as quickly, like a flash of light under a door. He wrote about the ranch and its history, how his father, James Fletcher, had come to Colorado in 1861 as a young man from Ohio with very little money and considerable stubbornness, and had built the operation from nothing. He wrote about what the drought of 1879 had cost them, which was 2 seasons of income and half the North herd, and how they had rebuilt. He wrote about the Cowboy brothers without naming them as villains but making clear that they were a pressure that required addressing, and that the addressing required a future the ranch currently lacked. He wrote about his mother, who had died when he was 14, and whose absence had shaped him in ways he was still discovering. He wrote about the porch in the evenings, and the way the light fell across the mountains, and the particular silence of the land before a snowstorm, which was the most absolute silence he had ever experienced. By the end of the 3rd week of letters, they had agreed that she would come for a 2-week visit, with the explicit understanding that neither of them was committed to anything, and either of them could end the arrangement at any point. He sent money for the train fare from Laramie to Denver, and arranged for the stage connection to Dusty Creek. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-November, stepping down from the stage in a brown wool coat and practical boots with mud already on them from some connection she had made at an overnight stop, carrying a large leather bag and a wooden case that he would learn contained her survey instruments. She was medium height, brown-haired, with a face that was direct and watchful and not conventionally pretty in the way that word was usually applied, but striking in the way that people are when they are entirely themselves without modification. He was waiting with the buckboard, hat in hand because his mother had taught him that, and he said, "Miss Prescott," and she looked at him for a long moment as though she was performing the same kind of assessment she would apply to a new piece of terrain, measuring elevation and angle and the likelihood of hidden features. Then she said, "Mr. Fletcher," and shook his hand, which was not what women in Dusty Creek generally did, and he found he respected it. He found he respected her enormously within the first hour, which was not what he had anticipated. He had anticipated liking her. He had anticipated a practical compatibility. He had not anticipated the feeling that she was the most real person he had met in a very long time. The first 2 days were cautious. They were polite to each other in the slightly formal way of people who have been honest on paper and are now determining whether the paper version corresponds to the real one. He showed her the ranch. She asked intelligent questions about the water rights and the fence lines and the grazing rotation, and he answered them without simplifying, the way he would have answered Hank, and noticed that she appreciated it. On the 3rd day she asked if she could look at the north parcel, the one he had mentioned in his letter as never properly surveyed, and he said yes, and she went out alone with her equipment in the cold morning and came back at midday with preliminary notes that showed a sharp eye and considerable expertise. And she set them on the kitchen table without ceremony and said, "You have a drainage problem on the northeast corner that's going to cost you pasture in a wet spring if it isn't addressed," and pointed to her notations. He stood beside her looking at the sketch map and felt something shift in his understanding of his own property, which was a strange and pleasant feeling. That evening they sat by the fire, and she told him about her father's death, which had been sudden, a fall from a horse on an icy survey site in December of 1881, a head injury, 3 days and then gone. And the grief in her voice was the grief of a person who had not had anyone to tell that to in a long time and who was not going to dress it up or make it digestible. He told her about his mother's death and his father's long solitude after it and how he had understood at 32 why a man might choose a long silent grief over the risk of another one. "That is why you waited this long," she said. "Not a question." "I suppose it is," he said. She looked at the fire. "I almost didn't come," she said. "I wrote the letter on a day when I was angrier than usual about the state of things, and then I almost did not send it, and then I thought, what is the worst that can happen? You waste a train journey." "And what is the best?" he asked. She looked at him then with that direct, measuring look. "I haven't decided yet," she said, and he laughed, and she smiled, and it was the first full smile he had seen from her, and it changed her face entirely, opened it up, made it warm in a way that caught him completely off guard. He was aware, after that evening, that the situation had moved beyond its original practical parameters. He was aware of it the way you are aware of weather changing, not by looking directly at it but by the changed quality of the air, the way everything feels slightly different without any single visible cause. He had been aware of it for 5 days when Hank Mulligan, who was not a subtle man, said to him while they were mending the south fence, "She's not going anywhere, you know." Clarence kept his eyes on the fence post. "I'm just observing," Hank said. "I've watched you the last few days, and I'm observing that you're not behaving like a man having a practical evaluation. You're behaving like a man who is worried about losing something." Clarence said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "She has her own life." "She does," Hank agreed. "But she is still here." She was still here. She had been here 11 days, the 2-week evaluation period 3 days from its end, and neither of them had mentioned leaving or staying. They had moved into a comfortable rhythm of morning coffee and evening conversation, and the particular silence that exists between people who have found, to their surprise, that being quiet in each other's company is not painful. It was on the 12th day that Clarence made his mistake. He had been thinking about the Calloway brothers. He had been thinking about Dale Calloway's smile at the last town meeting, the particular quality of that smile, the specific satisfaction of a man who believes he is watching someone else fail. He had been thinking about the ranch's finances and the land deed and the simple legal reality of the territory in 1882, which was that a married woman's property and income could, under certain circumstances, be legally absorbed into her husband's holdings depending on how the deed was arranged, and he had gone to Judge Hartley. Not with any intention of wrongdoing, he had told himself, but simply to understand the landscape, to know what the legal terrain looked like, to be prepared. He told himself it was just information gathering. He had not told Birdie. And then Walt Greer's wife, who was the most efficient information distribution system in Elbert County, had heard something from the judge's clerk, and the something had made its way to Birdie Prescott's ears on the morning of the 14th day, and Birdie had walked into the general store where Clarence happened to be collecting supplies, and she had looked at him with that expression, the settled, concluded expression, and picked up the letter from the counter where someone had left it and thrown it at his boots. Standing in the store now, in the ringing silence, Clarence understood that he had been exactly as stupid as a man can be when he is afraid of losing something and makes the mistake of trying to secure it by control rather than by honesty. "I was trying to protect the ranch," he said. You were trying to protect your ranch by ensuring my income was legally attached to it, she said. Which means you were looking for ways to secure an investment. Which means that when you wrote about partnership, you were managing me, not speaking to me. That is not, he stopped. He thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. That is not all of it, he said. But it is not none of it, and I know the difference matters. She watched him. I was afraid, he said. And when I am afraid, I become practical in ways that are not kind. I can see that now. Tell me the rest of it, she said. He looked at the people in the store and then looked at her, and he said, not here. She considered him. Then she said, all right, not here. They walked out of the store together into the cold November air of Dusty Creek's Main Street, and she walked beside him but not close, and they went to the buckboard and she climbed up without his help, which was, he was beginning to understand, not a statement about him, but simply the way she moved through the world. He drove them out of town in silence. The mountains to the west were white-capped, and the sky was the particular shade of deep blue that Colorado put on in the cold months, the kind of blue that looks like it belongs to a different atmosphere entirely, more serious and more beautiful than ordinary sky. Tell me, she said, when the town was behind them and there was nothing around but grassland and sky. He told her everything. He told her about the Calloway brothers and the pressure on the ranch, and the 2 years of being watched and waited on. And he told her about his conversation with Judge Hartley and what he had learned. And he told her that he had not intended to act on it, but had wanted to understand the full legal picture. And then he told her the part he had not yet admitted to himself, which was that somewhere in those 12 days he had stopped thinking of this arrangement as practical and started thinking of it as necessary in the way that water is necessary, and that the thought of her leaving had become unbearable in a way that had nothing to do with the Calloway brothers or the land deed, and that the fear of it had made him do something he was deeply ashamed of. He finished and looked at the mountains and waited. You are telling me you went to the judge because you were afraid I would leave, she said. I am telling you that is what I understand now, looking at it honestly. And when you realized that was the reason, why did you not simply tell me you were afraid I would leave? He looked at her then. Because that requires asking you to stay, he said. And asking you to stay means you might say no. She was quiet for a long time. The buckboard rolled along the frozen dirt road, and the horses moved in the steady, patient way of animals that have learned the route. Clarence, she said finally, and it was the first time she had used his first name, which both of them noticed. I am going to say something, and I want you to hear it fully. All right. I did not come here looking for a man to make my life smaller. My life has already been made smaller by a dozen different circumstances that I did not choose. I am not angry at you for being afraid. I am angry because you chose a secret instead of a conversation, and secrets are the thing I am least able to forgive, because my life before coming here was full of them. She paused. But I am also aware that I am sitting in this buckboard instead of on the noon stage back to Denver, and I think both of us ought to consider what that means. He was quiet. What does it mean? He asked. It means I have not entirely given up on you, she said. But I need you to understand that if there is ever another secret of this kind, I will go, and I will not come back, and no amount of practical fear will change that. I understand, he said. And the judge inquiry. I will go back to Judge Hartley tomorrow and withdraw any interest in the question, he said. Whatever you earn is yours. If we marry, and I am not assuming we will, I want it in writing. She turned to look at him. The wind had pulled some of her hair loose from its pins, and she did not bother fixing it, and the cold light of the afternoon made her look very clear and very present, like the landscape itself. You would put it in writing, she said. I would put it in writing, he said. I will have it drawn up by a lawyer in Denver if that is what it takes. I mean what I said in the advertisement, Birdie. I meant all of it. The silence this time was different from the one in the store. This one had warmth in it, or the beginning of warmth, the kind of thing that takes time to build, but once built holds against considerable cold. I have one more day on my evaluation period, she said. You do. I intend to use it to finish mapping the northeast corner of the north parcel, and then I will give you my answer." He nodded. "That seems fair." "It is very fair," she said, with a trace of the dark humor appearing briefly in her voice, and despite everything he found himself wanting to smile. He let it show. She did not smile back, but something in her face shifted slightly. And for Clarence Fletcher, who had become expert at reading landscapes, that slight shift was enough. The following morning she went out to the north parcel with her equipment, and he did not follow her, which was the hardest thing, because every instinct he had wanted to be in her vicinity, wanted to watch her work, wanted to be present for whatever she decided. Instead, he spent the morning doing his actual work, checking the south pasture fence where a section had gone soft in the recent cold, reviewing the feed inventory with Hank, and writing a note to Judge Hartley withdrawing his inquiry, which he had sealed and given to the boy who carried mail into town. Hank found him at noon staring at the north horizon. "She's still out there," Hank said unnecessarily. "I know." "What happened in town yesterday?" Clarence told him. Hank listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Hank. When Clarence finished, Hank said, "You are an idiot, I know, but you told her the truth after." "I did." Hank considered this. "She's still out there mapping your land," he said. "That tells you something." It did tell him something. He kept looking at the horizon. She came back in the mid-afternoon with the survey notes completed, and her cheeks red from the cold, and a particular expression that he was not able to read, which made him nervous in a way that was entirely new and entirely specific to her. She set the notes on the table and poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot that he had kept warm against her return, and she sat down across from him and looked at him for a long moment. "There is also a problem on the western edge of the north parcel," she said. "The fence line doesn't match the survey pins from what I can find, which means either the original survey was wrong or someone has moved a pin." Clarence went very still. "The Callaways own the land to the west," he said. "I know," she said. "I asked Mr. Mulligan, who owned the adjacent parcels, when I arrived. If the pin has been moved, then someone may have claimed a portion of your land that is legally yours. It would need to be officially surveyed and recorded with the county to correct it." She paused. "I can do that survey. I have done county recording surveys before, but it would take several more days." He looked at her. She looked at him. "Are you telling me you need more time?" he said. "I am telling you I have found a legitimate professional reason to stay longer if I wanted to, and that I am telling you about it honestly rather than pretending the decision is purely practical when it is not entirely that." He set down his coffee cup very carefully. "Birdie," he said. "I am not very good at this," she said, "in case you had not noticed." "You are doing extremely well," he said. "Better than I am." "You did better today than yesterday," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite warmth yet but was on its way. "Will you stay?" he asked, and then, because he had learned something in the last 24 hours, he added, "Not for the survey, for the other reason." She looked at her coffee cup. Then she looked up at him, and the directness that had characterized every look she had given him since she stepped off that stage was present and full, and there was something else in it now that had not been there before. "Yes," she said, "I will stay for the other reason." He let out a breath that he felt he had been holding since the general store. What followed were the 2 best weeks of Clarence Fletcher's life, and he would say so later to Hank, to the few men who were close enough to him to say such things to, and eventually to the children who asked him to tell the story of how he and their mother had come together, and who never tired of hearing it. She stayed and surveyed the north parcel properly. She found, when the work was done, that the fence line had been moved by nearly 30 feet along a 200-yard stretch of the western edge. 30 feet across 200 yards of Elbert County grassland may not sound like much, but it was enough. It was the kind of careful, incremental encroachment that the Callaway brothers had clearly been attempting over a period of years, shifting a pin here, a post there, slow enough to be almost invisible. When Birdie brought the survey results to County Recorder Amos Bell in Dusty Creek, accompanied by Clarence and the formal documentation of her survey credentials. Dale Calloway happened to be in the office. He was a broad man in his 50s, with a face that had settled into the specific expression of a man who had expected to get what he wanted for so long that entitlement had become his resting expression. He looked at Birdie Prescott with the survey documents in her hands, and his expression shifted through surprise to contempt to something harder and less comfortable. "And who is this?" he said. "I am B. Prescott, surveyor," Birdie said. She set the documents on the recorder's counter with the particular calmness of someone who has been told in various ways throughout their professional life that they do not belong in a room, and has developed a complete immunity to that message. Licensed by the Colorado Territory, these are the corrected survey records for the Fletcher North parcel with documentation of discrepancy between the original survey markers and the current fence line. Dale Calloway looked at Amos Bell. "Amos, it's a proper survey," Bell said, reviewing the documentation in a way that made clear he found it legitimate. "Filed correctly. I'll need to enter the correction." "There will be a legal challenge," Calloway said. "That is your right," Birdie said without looking at him. "The survey is accurate." She did not raise her voice. She did not acknowledge the threat beyond a single sentence. She just stood there in the county recorder's office in her practical brown coat and looked at the forms as Bell processed them, and Clarence stood beside her and felt the kind of pride that is different from satisfaction, the kind that goes deeper, that is about recognizing a specific quality in a specific person that you know you will not find everywhere. Outside, on the street, she finally looked up at him. Her expression was not triumphant, but it was steady, and there was a brightness in her eyes that was the closest she came to open satisfaction. "The Calloways will be unpleasant about this," she said. "Yes." "Are you worried?" "No," he said. He was not. He was not worried about a great many things he had been worried about 3 weeks ago, and the reason for it was standing beside him looking at him with that clear brown gaze that he had come to understand was one of the most genuinely honest things he had ever encountered. "Good," she said. "Neither am I." He asked her to marry him that evening on the porch, with the mountains in the distance and the cold air sharp around them, and the last of the sunset doing extraordinary things to the sky. He did not do it with a great speech. He had thought about a great speech and discarded it because it would have been performing for her, and she would have seen through the performance and found it less convincing than simplicity. Instead, he said, "I would like to ask you something, and I want you to know that however you answer it, I will respect that answer." She turned from looking at the mountains to looking at him. "I know this is not how most people do this," he said. "I know we have known each other for 3 weeks in person, and that 3 weeks is not very long. But I have known you longer than that in the ways that count, in the letters, in the honesty of them, in the work you've done here and the way you've done it. And I know that I want the rest of my life to have you in it. And I know that means asking rather than assuming. And I know the answer has to be yours freely and not because of any arrangement or any practical benefit to either of us." He paused. "Birdie Prescott," he said, "will you marry me?" She looked at him for a moment that stretched long enough that his heart did something involuntary and undignified, and then she said, "I have 2 conditions." He almost laughed from relief alone. "Name them." "The agreement about my earnings and property I wanted in writing before any marriage ceremony." "Done," he said immediately. "I already told you I would do that, and I want to keep the surveying work. Not all the time. I know the ranch needs tending and I am willing to do my share of that, but when survey work comes in that I can manage, I keep it." "Birdie," he said, "I put in the advertisement that I wanted a partner. I meant a partner. Your work is yours." She looked at the mountains for one more moment. Then she looked back at him and the full smile came, the one that opened her face and changed it, and it was different from the one in front of the fire, larger and less guarded, and he thought he would remember it for the rest of his life. "Then yes," she said, "I will marry you." He had been right. He remembered it for the rest of his life. They were married in the Dusty Creek Church on a Saturday in December of 1882, in a ceremony that was simple and attended by perhaps 20 people, including Hank Mulligan, who stood in the back with his hat in his hands and looked more moved than he would ever admit, and Walt Greer and his wife, who had the complicated privilege of being both the person who had inadvertently started the crisis in the general store and one of the warmest presences at the wedding, and County Recorder Amos Bell, and the Reverend Thomas Albright, who performed the ceremony with the pleasantly surprised expression of a man who had not expected to be officiating something this interesting. Birdie wore her good gray dress that she had brought from Laramie, which she had told Clarence she had packed on a hope she would describe as practical, but which he suspected was slightly more than that, and she looked, he thought, exactly like herself, which was the most beautiful thing she could have looked like. Before the ceremony, in the church office, they signed the legal agreement that Clarence had drawn up by a lawyer in Denver, a document that clearly established Birdie's right to her own earnings and her own professional property independent of the marriage arrangement. She read it carefully, every word, and then she looked up at him over the paper, and there was something in her expression that he could not entirely name, but that looked like relief and gratitude, and perhaps the specific satisfaction of a woman who has been promised something and is seeing the promise kept. She signed it first. He signed it after. The Calloway brothers were not at the wedding. Dale Calloway had, upon receiving the official correction to the county survey records, sent a letter to Clarence that was legally threatening but ultimately empty. Birdie reviewed it and said as much, and the legal challenge that Dale had promised had not materialized. It was the kind of threat that a man makes when he is angry and then does not pursue when he realizes the paperwork is properly done and the surveyor who did it knows what she is doing. "He'll find another angle," Birdie said when Clarence mentioned it shortly after the new year. "He always does," Clarence said. "Then we'll deal with the next angle when it comes," she said, with the calm of a person who has dealt with difficult terrain before and considers it a matter of preparation rather than anxiety. She was right, and the next angle came in February. The angle was this. Dale Calloway went to the First Bank of Denver's Elbert County representative and raised questions about the financial stability of the Fletcher ranch, suggesting, carefully, and without anything so crude as outright lying, that the ranch's recent losses in the drought years had left it more vulnerable than its surface appearance suggested, and that the land deed might be worth less as security than the bank believed. Clarence found out because the bank representative, a young man named Gregory Ferris, who had the specific decency of someone who is new to a job and has not yet learned to be political about it, told him directly. "Mr. Calloway came in last week," Ferris said, somewhat uncomfortably, and expressed concerns about the ranch's viability. "I want you to know because I believe the concerns were not made in good faith." Clarence thanked him and went home and told Birdie. She listened to the whole thing and then she said, "We need the accounts." They spent an evening going through the ranch's financial records, Clarence's methodical ledgers from the past 10 years, the cattle tallies, the crop records, the fence and equipment costs, and Birdie, who had spent years reading survey data and translating physical reality into legible documentation, went through it with the same precise attention she gave to a topographical map. "The ranch is solid," she said, at the end of it. "The drought years show a dip, but the recovery is clear. The trajectory is good. Anyone reading this honestly sees that. Calloway is not reading it honestly." "No," she said, "but the bank representative is." She looked at the ledgers. "I think we should request a formal meeting with Mr. Ferris and present the accounts ourselves, with the survey corrections on record, and let him see the full picture directly. A bank wants security. We can show him security." Clarence looked at her. "You want to go to the bank," he said. "I want to go to the bank," she confirmed. They went to the bank. The meeting with Gregory Ferris lasted 2 hours, and Birdie was the one who walked him through the financial record. Not because Clarence couldn't have done it, but because she could translate financial data the way she translated landscape, with precision and clarity, and the ability to make someone see what was actually there rather than what they feared might be there. By the end of the meeting, Farris had a complete picture of the ranch's financial health and had made clear that the bank's assessment of the Fletcher land as solid security was unchanged. He had also, Clarence noticed, looked at Birdie with the particular expression that appears on people's faces when they encounter competence. They were not expecting the expression of revising an assumption. Outside the bank, Birdie pulled on her gloves against the February cold and said nothing, and Clarence said, "Thank you." She looked at him. "What for?" "For knowing what needed to be done and doing it without fuss." She was quiet for a moment. "It's what partners do," she said simply. He reached over and took her gloved hand in his, and she let him, and they walked to the buckboard in the cold winter afternoon with the mountains white and sharp against the sky, and the whole territory stretching around them in every direction. The winter passed into spring with the kind of incremental warmth that makes the West feel newly created each year, the grass greening first in the low places where water ran, then spreading up the slopes, the air losing its edge, the mornings arriving earlier and easier. Birdie's survey work began to pick up in the spring. A rancher named Thomas Holt from the next county had heard about the Fletcher survey correction and sought her out specifically, wanting his own northeast boundary properly established after a dispute with a neighboring claim. Then the county itself contacted her about a road survey for a new route being planned between Dusty Creek and the larger town of Castle Rock. Then another rancher. Then a mining claim that needed to be properly bounded before it could be registered. The survey work meant she was sometimes away from the ranch for a day or two, never longer. She had decided that herself, not because he asked, but because she wanted to be home, and Clarence found that the quality of missing her was interesting. It was not painful in the way that absence usually was. It was more like the feeling of a room that was usually warm being temporarily at a lower temperature. Not uncomfortable exactly, just noticeable. And when she came back, there was always the evening to look forward to, the report of what she had found, the way she talked about land as a system of relationships, the specific pleasure of being the person she talked to at the end of the day. He was washing up after an evening in April when she said from the kitchen, "I have something to tell you." He came to the kitchen doorway. She was at the table, her survey notes spread in front of her in the usual organized disorder, but she was not looking at them. She was looking at the middle distance in the way of someone who has been sitting with a thought for a while and is now deciding how to say it. He came in and sat down. "I think," she said, and there was something in her voice that was different, a careful precision in it that felt like handling something fragile, "that we are going to have a child." He was very still. "I am not entirely certain," she said. "I will be more certain in a few more weeks, but I believe so." He looked at her face, which was watching him with that careful attention she brought to things that mattered, and he said, "How are you feeling?" She blinked. "I thought you would have a different first response." "How are you feeling?" he said again, something softened in her face. "I am feeling well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, not ill, just tired." She paused. "I'm not frightened of it, if that is what you're asking." "I wasn't sure what I was asking," he admitted. "I was just asking." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, which was one of her gestures that he had come to treasure precisely because she didn't make it often. It meant something specific when she did. "I am glad about it," she said. "I wasn't certain I would be. I wasn't certain about a great many things, but I am glad." "I am glad too," he said, "more than I know how to say." She looked at him for a moment with a full, quiet look that said she believed him, and that she knew how to hear what he meant even when he didn't have all the words for it. And he thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that whatever combination of circumstances had led her to answer that advertisement, he owed it a debt he had no proper way to repay. In May, the Calloway brothers attempted their final and most direct move. It was not as clever as their previous ones, which perhaps meant they were running out of options or patience or both. Dale Calloway filed a formal complaint with the county claiming that the survey correction had been improperly recorded and requesting that the original boundaries be reinstated pending a new survey conducted by a county-appointed surveyor. Birdie's response was crisp. She had kept copies of everything, every measurement, every pin location, every piece of supporting documentation. She brought it to the county surveyor's office in a bundle that was organized with the same meticulous care she brought to everything. And she walked the county surveyor, a man named Herbert Crane who had been doing land surveys in Elbert County for 15 years, through every point of the correction. Herbert Crane spent 2 days reviewing it. Then he wrote a formal opinion stating that the Prescott-Fletcher survey correction was accurate, properly documented, and correctly recorded, and that the original boundaries were therefore invalid. He also noted, in the formal language of a professional assessment, that the discrepancy between the original survey markers and the actual pin locations was not attributable to natural drift or surveying error, which was the document's careful way of suggesting that someone had moved them deliberately. The Callaway challenge was dismissed. Dale Callaway was seen in the Dusty Creek saloon the following Saturday in a state of mood that everyone around him found advisable to give a wide berth. His brother Royce came in later and they had a long, quiet conversation in the corner that no one could hear. And by Sunday morning, it was clear to the attentive observer, which Dusty Creek had no shortage of, that the Callaway brothers had arrived at the conclusion that the Fletcher ranch was not going to be easily absorbed, and that the person primarily responsible for this conclusion was a woman who had come from Wyoming with a theodolite and a direct gaze, and an apparently complete indifference to being pressured. They were not friendly after that, but they left the Fletchers alone, and in the practical geography of Elbert County in 1882, that was the equivalent of peace. Summer arrived in the way Colorado summers do, suddenly, brilliantly, the heat coming on with confidence after the long gray winter. Birdie's pregnancy was visible by July, and she continued her survey work through that month, riding out to survey sites in the early morning before the heat built and returning in the afternoon, adjusting her schedule with the same pragmatic attention she brought to everything. She had contracted with a woman in town named Mary Chen, who had come west from San Francisco with her husband 2 years earlier and who had training as a midwife, to advise throughout the pregnancy, and she had read everything available on the subject in the county and asked every question she could think of, which was, everyone who knew Birdie would have recognized immediately, exactly how she approached anything she needed to understand. Clarence tried not to hover. He was not entirely successful. Birdie told him so, with a trace of the dry humor that appeared at the exact moments when he needed it most. "You are watching me the way you watch the sky before a storm," she said one morning. "I am not a weather event. I know," he said. "I am going to be perfectly fine. Mary Chen says I am healthy and the pregnancy is progressing normally." "I know," he said again. She looked at him with full recognition of what was driving it. "I am not going anywhere," she said. "Do you hear me?" He heard her. He understood that she was not talking only about the survey ride she was preparing for. "I hear you," he said. She put her hand against his face briefly, another of her rare, specific gestures, and then went about the business of loading her equipment into the saddlebag, and he went about the business of the morning, and the ranch turned in its summer rhythm around them both. In September, Birdie Prescott Fletcher gave birth to a son. The labor was long, and Clarence spent most of it on the porch of the house he had told her about in his letters, the porch where he had sat with Hank and been told he needed to advertise for a wife, walking back and forth with a controlled anxiety that Hank, who sat in a chair against the wall with his arms folded, watched and chose not to comment on, being wise enough to understand that some forms of waiting cannot be improved by conversation. Mary Chen was inside, calm and competent in the way that made Clarence, every time he briefly entered the house to check, feel slightly more able to breathe. She had brought another woman with her, a neighbor named Agnes Farrar who had 4 children of her own and who had the settled, no-nonsense presence of someone for whom this territory was well mapped. When the sound from inside the house changed, When there was a new sound, smaller and with a completely different quality, Clarence stopped walking. Hank unfolded his arms and said nothing. A few minutes later, Mary Chen appeared in the doorway. She looked at Clarence and she was smiling. "A boy," she said. "A healthy boy, and Birdie as well." Clarence sat down on the porch steps because his legs, which had carried him back and forth across this porch for 7 hours, had apparently decided they were done holding him up now that they were not strictly required to. Hank's hand came down on his shoulder and stayed there for a moment. "Go in," Hank said. He went in. Birdie was in the bed, propped up slightly, and she looked exhausted in the specific beautiful way of people who have done something that cost everything they had and found that they had enough. She had the baby in her arms, and she looked up when Clarence came in, and her expression was not dramatic. It was quieter and larger than drama, the way the most significant things always are when you are actually inside them. He came to the bedside and sat in the chair Mary Chen had placed there. He looked at the baby, who was red-faced and small and making the specific sounds that new people make, sounds that appear to come from some older, more urgent language. "He has your ears," Birdie said, and her voice was tired and warm and wholly hers. "They will grow into better ones," Clarence said, which made her make a sound that was almost a laugh. "What do we call him?" she asked. They had discussed names, but somewhat obliquely, in the way of two people who are superstitious about planning too concretely for something not yet here. He had a name he had thought about but not said. "James," he said. "For my father." She looked at the baby and then up at him. "James Fletcher," she said, trying it. "Yes, that suits him." "And your father's name as a middle name," Clarence said. James William Fletcher." She was quiet for a moment. Her hand tightened very slightly around the baby. "James William Fletcher," she said softly. She looked at Clarence, then with an expression he had not seen from her before, one that contained everything. The gratitude and the grief and the love, and the newness of it all, and the exhaustion and the happiness, all of it at once, all of it real and specific and entirely her. He reached over and took her free hand, the way she sometimes took his, and held it, and they sat in the room with the mountain light coming through the window and the evening settling over the ranch, and the new and specific life that was James William Fletcher making his small sounds in his mother's arms. Hank Mulligan, when he finally came inside to see the baby, looked at the infant for a long moment and said with his usual economy, "Good-looking child," and then looked at both of them and said, "I'm glad you wrote that advertisement is all," and went back outside before either of them could respond. The year turned. James William Fletcher grew at the rate that babies grow, rapidly and thoroughly, changing in ways that were different every time you looked, developing opinions about the world with an enthusiasm that suggested he had inherited his mother's directness and his father's stubbornness in equal measure. Birdie returned to her survey work in the spring, more selectively than before, taking the assignments that could be managed within a day or near enough. She had become, in the 2.5 years since her arrival in Dusty Creek, the most respected surveyor in Elbert County, which she had achieved not by any particular campaign for recognition, but simply by doing the work precisely and honestly and often, and letting the record make itself. There were those who had opinions about a married woman with a child working professionally. Birdie had opinions about those people's opinions, which she expressed concisely when asked and not at all when not asked. And Clarence's opinion was that it was her life and her work, and that the ranch was better for her mind being engaged, and that anyone who thought otherwise was not someone whose counsel he required. They disagreed sometimes, as people who are genuinely engaged with each other do. They disagreed about the repair schedule for the south barn, which she thought should be prioritized before the late summer, and he thought could wait until fall. She was right, as it happened, because the south barn's roof situation deteriorated faster than either of them expected, and the early repair saved significant damage. He told her she was right. She said she knew, and there was the humor in her voice, and they had a good argument about whose judgment should prevail in future barn-related disputes that ended with both of them laughing on the porch in the late evening while James, 2 years old by then, slept inside. They disagreed about whether to accept an offer from a Denver land developer who wanted to buy the western portion of the north parcel, the very land whose boundaries Birdie had established in her first survey. Clarence was inclined to consider it. Birdie was not. "That land connects our north water access to the south pasture," she said, spreading her survey map on the table between them. "If we sell the western strip, we segment the water flow and we compromise the grazing rotation. The short-term income is less valuable than the long-term structure." He looked at the map. He looked at her. "Walk me through it," he said. She did, and she was right, and they declined the offer. It was not always that Birdie was right and Clarence wrong, or vice versa. Sometimes he knew things about the land and the cattle and the local relationships that she deferred to, because she was honest enough to know the limits of her own knowledge, which was one of the things that made her judgment so reliable when she did apply it. Sometimes they were wrong together, which happened twice. Once about a feed supplier who turned out to be unreliable, and once about a fence contractor who did inferior work. And they dealt with the consequences together without either of them making it about fault, which was harder than it sounds, and which they were not always perfect at, but which they returned to as a practice because it was the right one. In the summer of 1884, their second child arrived. Another boy, born in July with less drama than James William and more noise, immediately and with intention. They named him Daniel Robert Fletcher Daniel because Birdie had always liked the name, and Robert for no reason that was entirely articulable except that it suited him, which was reason enough. James was nearly 2 years old by then and took a measured, evaluative interest in his brother, examining the new arrival with the same careful attention his mother brought to new terrain, and apparently arriving at the conclusion that this was acceptable, because by the time Daniel was 3 months old, James had appointed himself the new baby's primary guardian and took the responsibility extremely seriously. Clarence watched this development with a feeling that was too large for any simple word. It was the feeling of a man who had been afraid, for a very long time, of the specific loneliness of this house, who had walked through 4 empty bedrooms and felt the weight of all the life that was supposed to be in them, and who was now watching those bedrooms fill with exactly what they were built for. One October evening, when both boys were asleep, and the house was quiet with that specific warm quiet of children sleeping nearby, Clarence and Birdie sat on the porch as they had sat on many evenings. The mountains to the west were layered purple and gray in the dusk. The air was cold and clear, and carried the smell of pine from the high slopes. She had her coffee and he had his, and they sat without talking for a while, because they had learned the particular pleasure of a silence shared with someone who does not require you to fill it. "I have been thinking," she said eventually, "about the advertisement." He looked at her. "Not with regret," she said quickly, and the dry humor was there. "I have been thinking that it was the strangest, most improbable series of events that anyone could have designed. You wrote an advertisement that any sensible man would have made more palatable, and you made it honest instead. And I wrote a response that I nearly didn't send to an advertisement I nearly didn't answer because I was angrier than usual on a particular afternoon. And if you hadn't sent it," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I would have carried on, I suppose, done the work, found some arrangement that was adequate." She looked at the mountains. "But I would have been waiting for something I didn't have a name for. I understand that now." He thought about the evenings he had spent on this porch before she came. The particular quality of that waiting, which he had told himself was patience, but which he now understood, was simply the absence of something he hadn't known he needed. "I put in the advertisement that I wanted a partner," he said. "I didn't know what that meant until I met someone who showed me." She turned to look at him, and the expression on her face in the October dusk was the full, open one, the one that had startled him the first time he saw it and that still did every time because it was not a face she showed without meaning it. "You are not a difficult man to love," she said, "when you are not being an idiot." "The ratio has improved," he said. "It has," she agreed with complete seriousness. He reached over and she moved toward him, and they sat close together in the cold evening, with the mountains going dark around them and the lights of the house behind them where their boys slept, and the land spread out in every direction. The land she had surveyed and mapped, the land that was theirs jointly and deliberately, the land that carried the record of every season they had been through together. "Thank you," he said, to the mountains and the evening and to her, which were in that moment the same thing. "For what specifically?" she asked. "For sending the letter," he said. "For getting on the train, for throwing that letter at my boots instead of just leaving. For every time you told me the truth when it would have been easier to be quiet." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for writing honestly," she said. "For meaning what you said in the advertisement, for going back to Judge Hartley, for signing the agreement without being asked twice." She paused. "For asking me to stay for the other reason." They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them inside, and they went into the warm house and checked on the sleeping boys and banked the fire for the night and went to bed with the kind of ease that is not the absence of history, but the presence of it, settled and chosen, the way a foundation is chosen, built carefully, under pressure, meant to hold. The following year brought more survey work, a particularly good cattle season, a new roof on the south barn that Birdie supervised herself and that Clarence acknowledged was done better for her oversight, and a trip to Denver in the spring that was the first time either of them had been to the city together, which they approached like a survey expedition, with preparation, with attention, and with the awareness that seeing something new together is a different experience from seeing it alone. They took the boys. James, nearly 4, was interested in everything. Daniel, not quite 2, was interested in everything that moved, which was the same quality but with different practical implications. In Denver, Birdie went to a professional surveyors gathering that she had been corresponding with for some months, a small group of practitioners from across the territory, mostly men, who had organized to discuss standards and equipment and the challenges of survey work in high-altitude terrain. She was the only woman. She had been the only woman in many rooms, and she had developed her practice of entering them with the same professional presence she would bring if she were not, and letting the quality of her work make whatever argument was necessary. A man named Carl Andrus, who ran the largest survey firm in Colorado, introduced himself to her after the meeting. He was direct, which she appreciated. He said he had heard of her work through the county correction in Elbert County, and through Thomas Holt's boundary survey, and through several other references, and he wondered if she had considered taking on contracted work that reached beyond individual county-level territorial surveys, road planning work, the kind of large-scale projects that were going to be increasingly necessary as Colorado moved toward statehood. She told him she would consider it and write to him with her answer, which she did 2 weeks after returning to the ranch, accepting a consulting arrangement that she had thought through carefully and negotiated on terms that suited the ranch schedule and the family. Clarence's response when she told him about it was to say, "Territorial-level work. You'll have work coming from all directions." "I expect so," she said, watching him. "You'll need a better horse," he said. She stared at him for a moment, and then she laughed, a full, genuine laugh, which was one of the things he worked to produce as often as possible, because it was one of the finest sounds he had encountered. "That is not what I expected you to say," she said. "What did you expect?" "I expected you to say it would require careful management." "It will require careful management," he said, "and a better horse." She got the better horse. A gray mare she found through a livestock trader out of Pueblo, a 3-year-old with a good gait and considerable stamina and the sort of steady temperament that was right for survey work. She named her Theodolite, which Clarence said was too long and which Birdie said was the appropriate name for a horse that was going to support survey operations, and the horse was called Theo in practice, which satisfied both of them. The year that James turned 5 and Daniel turned 3, Birdie discovered she was expecting again, and this time the news had a different quality to the telling. There was less uncertainty in it, more simple warmth. They sat at the kitchen table where they had sat on that first evening 2 years into their marriage when she had told him, and watched his face for his first response. "How are you feeling?" He said again, the same words, immediate. She smiled at him with full recognition. "Well," she said, "I am feeling well." This baby was a girl, born in April of 1886, in the room where James had been born, and where Daniel had been born, with Mary Chen present again. Older and, if possible, calmer, in the way that experience makes things calmer. They named her Clara Ann Fletcher. Clara because it was Birdie's mother's name, which she had not mentioned to Clarence until the day they discussed it, and Anne because it was simple and clean and suited the person she immediately seemed to be. James, at 5, took the news of a sister with the thoughtful assessment he brought to all new information, and announced after a week of careful observation that Clara was acceptable. Daniel, at 3, was in complete agreement with everything Clara did from the moment she arrived, a disposition that did not change as they grew. The ranch expanded in 1887, not by purchasing new land. They did not need more land, and Birdie, who understood the carrying capacity of terrain as well as anyone in the county, had said clearly that more land was not the answer to more stability, that the answer was better management of what they had, but by diversifying what they did with it. They added a small apple orchard on the south-facing lower slope that Birdie had identified years earlier as having the right aspect for it. They improved the irrigation on the main pasture, using principles she had learned from a survey project on a larger operation near Fort Collins. They added a second barn for proper winter storage of feed, the planning of which Birdie and Clarence worked on together over many evenings at the kitchen table with maps and tallies, and the occasional disagreement that ended in a better solution than either of them had started with. Hank Mulligan turned 50 in 1887 and received at his birthday celebration a modest affair at the ranch, with Birdie's considerable cooking and a great deal of coffee, a letter that surprised everyone, including Hank. It was from a woman named Margaret Cross, who was a schoolteacher in the neighboring county, and who had, through a mutual acquaintance, been corresponding with Hank for some months. The letter in question was one he had written to her, which had been returned with her reply, and which he had somehow left in his coat pocket, and which James Fletcher, now 6 and old enough to help carry things, had retrieved and delivered to the table with complete innocence. Hank went a color that no one at the ranch had ever seen him go before. Birdie, who had the instincts of someone who recognized the situation precisely, said without looking up from the coffee she was pouring, "Margaret Cross is a fine name." "She is an excellent schoolteacher," said Clarence with equal neutrality. "Married women should be invited to supper," James offered helpfully. Hank looked at all of them and said, "I am going to go check the south fence," despite the fact that it was 8 o'clock in the evening. Margaret Cross came to supper 3 weeks later and was a warm, forthright woman who spoke directly and laughed easily, and who had, within 20 minutes of meeting Birdie, initiated a conversation about female professional experience in the territory that went on for an hour and a half and that Clarence and Hank eventually gave up trying to follow. Hank and Margaret were married the following spring, in the same church where Clarence and Birdie had been married, and the Fletchers were at the front pew, all 5 of them, James in his good shirt, Daniel in a matching one, and Clara at 2 years old in a dress that Birdie had made from blue wool. Clarence looked at Birdie during the ceremony with the particular look of 2 people who are remembering their own version of what is happening in front of them, and she looked back at him with full recognition, and they didn't need to say anything about it because they had long since developed the vocabulary of expression that means you don't always have to. By 1888, the Fletcher Ranch was the most prosperous it had been since before the drought years, which Clarence noted in the ledger with his usual precision, and which Hank noted out loud without precision, but with great satisfaction. The cattle operation was strong. The orchard had produced its first commercial harvest, small but promising. Birdie's survey practice had an established reputation across 3 counties, and she was in the process of completing the largest project she had taken on a territorial road survey that Carl Andrus's firm had contracted, mapping the prospective route of a new road between Castle Rock and Lemon. She came home from the second week of that survey in the early autumn of 1888 with the look she got when she had been working intensely, and a specific brightness behind the tiredness, the satisfaction of work that had been done exactly right. She set her equipment on the porch and went inside to find Clarence in the kitchen with all 3 children, which was a domestic scene that she stood in the doorway and observed for a moment with an expression that was entirely hers. The full, warm, open expression that she had given him first on the porch in November of 1882, which had not diminished in the 6 years since. He looked up and saw her in the doorway, and his face did the thing it did when she came home, which he had no particular control over and which she had never in 6 years told him to stop. "Survey's done?" he asked. "Survey's done," she said. "I need coffee, and you need to know that I may have agreed to a second territorial project starting in the spring which we should discuss." "We'll discuss it," he said. "I know we will," she said. "That is why I said it out loud instead of waiting." James at 7 said, "Mama, Daniel put the good coffee cup in the water bucket." "Did he?" Birdie said. Daniel at 5 said, "I was seeing if it floated." "Did it?" "No." "That is useful information," she said with perfect seriousness, and came into the kitchen to recover the coffee cup and start the coffee and begin the evening that she had been looking forward to all day, the way she had been looking forward to it for 6 years. The specific, particular pleasure of coming home to this house, and these people, and this man who had written an honest advertisement in October of 1882 and meant every word of it. The coffee cup was dry. The coffee was strong. The children were fed and bathed and put to bed in the sequence that had become the evening's reliable architecture, James reading to himself in the lamplight, Daniel refusing to stay in bed until Clarence sat on the edge of it for a full 10 minutes, Clara asleep before her head touched the pillow in the way she always was, swift and total. They sat on the porch after, the October air cold around them again, 6 Octobers from the first one. The mountains were the same. The sky was the same extraordinary deep Colorado blue. The land was theirs and known and mapped and cared for. 6 years, Birdie said. "In November," he said. "In November," she agreed. "Are you still glad you answered it?" He asked, not anxiously, with the ease of someone who knows the answer but wants to hear it. She looked at the mountains and then at him, and the expression on her face was the full, unguarded one. "Every day," she said. "Even the ones where you are being an idiot." "The ratio has improved," she finished. "Yes, I know." And she leaned against him, which she did sometimes in the evenings when the day had settled, and there was no one watching and no one to perform for, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together in the cold autumn evening on the porch of the house that had been built for exactly this, and the land stretched out around them in the dark, known and mapped and loved. In the spring of 1889, Colorado was preparing for statehood considerations that had been ongoing for years, and the territorial road survey that Birdie completed was incorporated into a larger state planning document, which meant her name appeared in official Colorado territory records as the surveying practitioner responsible for a significant portion of the new road's documentation. Carl Andrus wrote to her about it with what she recognized as genuine professional respect, noting that her work was the cleanest documentation in the project. She showed Clarence the letter. He read it and said, "B. Prescott Fletcher, Territorial Surveyor." "B. Prescott on the professional records," she said. "I use both names in different contexts. You should put your full name on everything," he said. She looked at him. "Birdie Prescott Fletcher is the person who did that work," he said. "Both names matter." She was quiet for a moment with the specific quality of someone receiving something they hadn't asked for but needed. "I'll write to Carl Andrus," she said. She did. In 1890, Dale Calloway sold his remaining holdings in Elbert County and moved to Kansas, which was not something anyone had predicted, but which was greeted by the Fletcher household with the equanimity of people who have not spent their energy on enmity and have none of the particular satisfaction that requires long cultivation. "He's gone," Hank reported one morning. "All right," said Birdie, who was at the table reviewing survey notes. "That's it," Hank said. "What would you like me to do about it?" she said. Hank looked at Clarence. Clarence shrugged. Hank shook his head in a way that combined affection and exasperation, which was the primary mode in which he related to both of them. That same year in the summer, James Fletcher turned 9 years old and announced that he intended to learn surveying. He had been watching his mother's work for years with increasing interest, and the specific way he had of looking at land, measuring it with his eyes, noticing the way water moved, and where the ground changed was unmistakable to anyone who had seen Birdie do the same thing. Birdie took him out to the north parcel on a Saturday morning with a compass and a measuring chain, and spent the morning teaching him the basics of traversing a boundary line. He was careful and methodical and asked good questions, and she came home at midday and told Clarence that James had a surveyor's eye. "He has your eye," Clarence said. "He has a good eye," she said. "What he does with it is his business." She paused. "But I am going to make sure he knows how to use it properly." Daniel, at 8, was considerably less interested in surveying and considerably more interested in horses, which suited the ranch and which Clarence recognized as a natural disposition that did not need to be redirected. Clara, at 4, was interested in everything with equal and intense ferocity, and had already learned from her father how to read, and from her mother how to use a compass, and from Hank Mulligan, apparently, some vocabulary that Mary Chen had described as impressive for a 4-year-old, the source of which Hank denied with unconvincing innocence. They were all of them, all 5, sitting at supper on a Wednesday evening in September of 1890, the kind of evening that is unremarkable except that later, when you remember it, you understand it was exactly the right kind of full, and Clarence looked around the table at this particular collection of people. James explaining something about fence line angles to Daniel, who was listening with partial attention. Clara eating methodically through her beans with the serious efficiency of a small general. Birdie pouring coffee and saying something to James about the angle calculation that corrected him with such precision and warmth that he absorbed it without deflation, which was a skill of hers that he was still learning to do as well as she did. He thought about the porch and Hank saying you need to write an advertisement. He thought about the letter he had written and the 11 responses, and the one he had read 4 times. He thought about the stage arriving in November, and the woman in the brown coat with mud on her boots who had looked at him, with the measuring, careful look of someone deciding whether the terrain was what the map claimed. He thought about the letter thrown at his boots in the general store and the drive home, and the question told me the rest of it. He thought about all of it, and he thought every single piece of it was necessary. Every piece had to be exactly as it was. After supper, when the children were settled, James reading, Daniel already asleep, Clara in a prolonged and creative negotiation with the concept of bedtime that Birdie was managing with the specific calm of someone who is simultaneously amused and immovable, Clarence went to the porch. Birdie came out a few minutes later, the Clara negotiation concluded, and sat beside him. The evening star was up. The mountains were dark shapes against a sky that still held some light in the west, the last of it going in bands of rose and gold. "She wanted to sleep outside," Birdie said. "I told her when she was older." "What did she say?" "She asked how old." "What did you say?" "I said old enough to make a proper camp," which was not the answer she wanted, but which she accepted because she is interested in the camp-making aspect. He smiled. Birdie looked at the mountains. "Are you happy?" he asked. She turned to look at him, and the expression on her face was the answer before she said it, but she said it anyway, clearly and directly, the way she said all the things she meant. "Yes, are you?" "Completely," he said. She took his hand in both of hers, the gesture that was specifically hers and specifically meant, and they sat together in the September evening as the last light left the sky and the stars came on one by one over the mountains, and the house behind them was warm and full, and the land around them was good and known, and there was nothing left open, nothing left unresolved, nothing that needed to be waited on. Everything had arrived. Everything was here. And Birdie Prescott Fletcher, who had been the last woman anyone expected to answer that advertisement, who had almost not sent the letter on a particular angry afternoon in Laramie, who had thrown a letter at a man's boots in a general store and demanded the truth and gotten it, held her husband's hand in the September dark, and thought that the territory was full of harder and stranger roads than the one she had taken, but that she could not have asked for a better destination, and that she would choose it again, every time without hesitation. Clarence Fletcher, who had been the last bachelor in 3 counties and who had known it and written an honest advertisement anyway, looked at the woman beside him and thought the same thing, in the specific and private language of a man who is not good at large speeches but who is, when it counts, entirely certain. They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them in, as they had on the night she had said yes, as they had on 100 evenings between. They went inside to the warm house and the sleeping children and the banked fire and the morning that would come with its ordinary requirements and particular pleasures, and the day after that and all the days that followed, which were not perfect and were not without hardship but were deeply and continuously theirs. The advertisement had been a beginning. The beginning had become a life. The life was enough. The life was more than enough. The life was everything.